She's been living off my son's money for 3 years. My mother-in-law told the mediator, her hands folded like she was reciting scripture. She has no job, no skills, and no contribution to this marriage. She is asking for half of what my son built. That is not a settlement. That is theft. I didn't look at her. I looked at the water stain on the ceiling of the conference room, a brown ring the shape of a question mark, like the building itself was asking what I was still doing there. The room smelled like recycled air and someone's burned coffee. My soon-to-be ex-husband, the man I had spent 4 years cooking breakfast for and driving to the airport at 5 in the morning and believing when he said I was his partner, sat across from me like a stranger wearing his face. His name doesn't matter anymore. I'll call him what his mother made him, her son. My name is Claire Sutherland. I am 32 years old. And for the last 40 minutes, I have been sitting in a mediation conference room in downtown Denver, listening to his family describe a woman I didn't recognize. Have you ever sat perfectly still while someone dismantled your life in front of witnesses, and the only reason you didn't speak was because you knew something they didn't? Leave me a comment below. I'd love to know I'm not alone in this. The mediator's name was Mr. Ashworth. 50-something, reading glasses on a beaded chain, a yellow legal pad in front of him that he kept tapping with the eraser end of his pencil. He had the careful neutrality of a man who had heard every version of every story and believed almost none of them. He looked at me when my mother-in-law finished speaking, a silent invitation to respond. I took a sip of water, tap water, from a plastic pitcher on the credenza. Flat, faintly metallic, I set the cup down without a sound. I'll let my attorney address the financial questions, I said. My voice was even. I had worked very hard to make it even. My mother-in-law made a soft sound in her throat, something between a laugh and a scoff. She was a woman who wore pearls to mediation. Real ones. She had shown up with her son's divorce attorney, her own attorney, and her husband, my father-in-law, who sat in the corner like a prop she had brought to add gravity to her side of the room. They thought this was going to be simple. They thought I was going to cry. I need to explain something about the Sutherland family because none of what happened that afternoon makes sense without it. They were old Denver money, not spectacular wealth, but the kind that had been sitting in the same zip code for 4 generations and had calcified into identity. They owned a commercial real estate company that my father-in-law had built and that her son had grown up assuming he would inherit. In their world, a wife was an accessory to a legacy. She attended charity galas. She organized the holiday dinners. She did not have a separate professional life because a separate professional life implied she might have somewhere to go. When I married him, I was 28 and working under an NDA so comprehensive that I couldn't explain my job to most people without triggering a clause. I was a senior security architect for a federal contracting firm. I built the kind of digital infrastructure that, if I named the clients, would make most people go quiet. I'm not saying that to sound impressive. I'm saying it because the secrecy was real, the work was consuming, and to anyone who didn't know the particulars, I looked, on paper, like a woman who did nothing. That was the weapon they chose. My mother-in-law had spent 3 years calling me a housewife in a tone that made clear she didn't mean it as a compliment. She meant it as a verdict. She couldn't understand why a woman who didn't work needed privacy about her schedule, her phone calls, her travel. She went through my husband's emails looking for evidence of what I actually did. She found nothing. Nothing she could understand anyway. And in the Sutherland universe, if a thing couldn't be explained at a dinner table, it didn't count. The marriage ended for a lot of reasons. But the paperwork cited irreconcilable differences, which is what you write when the real answer is too complicated for a form. What I hadn't told anyone, not yet, was that 3 weeks before the mediation, my attorney had filed a subpoena request for my employment records as part of the asset disclosure process. My firm's legal department had responded by contacting the Office of General Counsel for the Department of Homeland Security. The firm I worked for held 2 active federal contracts classified at the level that required judicial review before any employment documentation could be produced in a civil proceeding. The response had arrived in my attorney's office 4 days ago in a sealed courier envelope, a gray one, not black. That's what DHS uses instead of the Gold Eagle D&I seal you see in the movies. She hadn't opened it yet, We'd agreed to wait. We were waiting for this room. My attorney's name was Josephine Tran. She was 44, 5'2", and had spent 14 years as a litigator before pivoting to high-conflict family law. She wore her hair pulled straight back and had a habit of clicking her pen exactly 3 times before she spoke, like she was cocking a trigger. She did not perform for rooms. She did not need to. She had a particular kind of stillness that made opposing counsel nervous because they could never tell if she was listening or already 3 moves ahead. She was always 3 moves ahead. My mother-in-law's attorney, a man named Douglas Walsh, had been pressing the financial issue with considerable energy. He kept returning to the same point. I had no verifiable income during the marriage. Therefore, I had no grounds for an equitable claim to assets acquired during the marriage. Therefore, the settlement offer on the table, a modest flat sum and no stake in the property portfolio, was not only fair, it was generous. The property portfolio, for context, included a ski condo in Breckenridge that I had found, researched, and negotiated the purchase price on while her son was in Phoenix for a golf weekend. It included a rental property in the Wash Park neighborhood that I had managed the renovation permits for. It included 4 years of my organizational labor, my travel coordination, my presence at every client dinner, every board spouse event, every function where my husband needed a partner who could talk to anyone and disappear when required. None of that appeared on paper. It never does. Walsh was in the middle of presenting a spreadsheet, an actual printed spreadsheet, color-coded, with my column labeled non-contributing spouse, when Josephine clicked her pen. Once. Twice. 3 times. Walsh paused. "The defense of marital contribution," Josephine said, her voice the temperature of a February morning, "is not limited to W-2 income. We are prepared to address that point in full. But first, since opposing counsel has raised the question of my client's employment status, I'd like to enter something into the record." She reached into her briefcase. She did not make a show of it. She simply placed the gray envelope on the table in front of Mr. Ashworth. He looked at it, at the seal on the upper left corner, at the case designation stamped in blue ink. Walsh leaned forward. "What is that?" "That," Josephine said, "is a response from the Department of Homeland Security to the employment verification subpoena filed 3 weeks ago. My client's employer holds 2 active federal contracts under classification protocols that restrict public disclosure of personnel records, work product, and client identity. This document provides the court-admissible verification of her continuous employment status and compensation for the duration of the marriage." The room did something I had not expected. It didn't go loud, it went very, very quiet. My father-in-law, who had not spoken a single word in 40 minutes, slowly uncrossed his legs. My mother-in-law's expression didn't change. It froze. There is a difference. When an expression changes, the muscles move. When it freezes, you can see the moment a person realizes they have been wrong in a way they cannot recover from in the next 60 seconds. Her son looked at me for the first time since we'd sat down. I did not look back at him. Mr. Ashworth picked up the envelope with both hands. He examined the seal. He looked at Josephine. "You're representing that this is a verified government document subject to judicial review under the federal contract disclosure protocols?" "I am," she said. "The verification code is printed on the outer seal. It can be confirmed with DHS case coordination by phone within 15 minutes. Walsh stood up so fast his chair rolled back and hit the credenza. This is a civil asset proceeding. This has no bearing." "It has direct bearing," Josephine said, not raising her voice by a single degree. "Opposing counsel spent the last 30 minutes arguing that my client has no verifiable employment history and therefore no basis for an equitable claim. That argument requires that she has no employment history. This document establishes that she has been continuously employed as a senior security architect under federal contract for the last 6 years, including the entirety of the marriage. At a compensation level," she paused, "that substantially exceeds your client's reported W-2 income for 3 of the 4 marriage years." I heard my mother-in-law exhale. It was a very small sound. Mr. Ashworth opened the envelope. The document was 4 pages. He read the first page, then he read it again. His pen was completely still. "Ms. Sutherland," he said, and his voice had shifted into a register I hadn't heard from him yet. Not the careful neutrality of a mediator, but the measured attention of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the room. "You've been under a federal non-disclosure agreement for the duration of your employment?" "Since before the marriage," I said. "And the nature of the work is described in general terms on page 2, Josephine said. "Specifically, the document confirms that my client served as lead architect on 2 infrastructure security frameworks for federal agencies, both of which remain active. Her schedule, travel, and communications during the marriage were subject to federal conduct protocols. Her inability to discuss her work with family members was not a personal choice, it was a legal obligation." Walsh sat back down slowly, like a man whose knees had stopped working. My husband, my almost former husband, was staring at the table. I watched something move across his face. It wasn't guilt, not yet. It was the particular expression of a person realizing they have been carrying a story about someone for years, a story that felt certain and solid and righteous, and the story was wrong, not exaggerated, wrong, built on nothing but the absence of information they were never entitled to have. His mother had given him that story. She had handed it to him like an inheritance, like it was something that had always been true. He had believed her. He had chosen to believe her, which is different from being deceived. I want to be fair about that. I spent a lot of time during the marriage trying to defend myself against a narrative I legally could not disprove. I came home from a week in a federal facility in Northern Virginia, jet-lagged and carrying work I couldn't describe, and I would walk into the kitchen to find a silence that told me his mother had called. I would try to explain, in the most general terms possible, that I had been working. He would nod with his mouth, but not his eyes. He had already decided what I was. I paid our health insurance premiums for all 4 years of our marriage because his company's plan had a coverage gap that would have left him exposed after a skiing accident in year 2. I funneled it through a separate account so he wouldn't have to absorb the cost while his company was reorganizing. He thought the payments were an automatic holdover from my pre-marriage plan. He never asked. I never corrected him, because the correction would have required explaining the account, which would have required explaining the income, which would have required violating my NDA. When his father's company hit a liquidity crisis in 2022 and needed a short-term bridge to avoid defaulting on a commercial loan, I contacted a financial intermediary I knew through federal contract-adjacent work and arranged a referral to a private lender who offered terms the bank wouldn't. His father thought he'd gotten lucky with a LinkedIn connection. He sent me a fruit basket at Christmas. A fruit basket. I watched my mother-in-law sitting very still across the table. She had pearls on and a prepared face and a story she had told so many times she had started to believe it had always been true. The story was, I was a burden. The story was, her son had supported me. The story was I owed them gratitude, or at minimum, I owed them silence. The story was dissolving in real time, right there in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Denver, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Mr. Ashworth set the document down. He took his reading glasses off. He looked at Walsh. "Counselor," he said, "I'd like to give you a few minutes to confer with your client before we continue." Walsh was already leaning toward my mother-in-law, his voice low and rapid. Her son hadn't moved. Josephine clicked her pen once and wrote something on her legal pad. I looked at the water stain on the ceiling again, the question mark shape. I had been asking that question for 4 years. What am I doing here? Why am I still trying to make this work? Why do I keep showing up for people who have already decided who I am? I had my answer now. I wasn't still trying, I was finished. The settlement conference reconvened 22 minutes later. Walsh looked like a man who had just received a diagnosis, not catastrophic but significant, the kind that required him to revise his plans. He did not use the term non-contributing spouse again. The revised settlement proposal acknowledged equitable contribution to marital assets and included a full stake in the Breckenridge property, a fair share of the Wash Park rental income stream, and a reimbursement for the insurance premiums. It did not include everything I was entitled to, so Josephine pushed back on 2 line items and we settled the rest within 40 minutes. My mother-in-law signed the acknowledgement form with a pen that I could see her gripping too tightly. She didn't look at me. She was looking at the wall above my head, at the neutral gray paint, at the middle distance where you look when you're trying to get through something without showing what it's costing you. I understood the feeling. I had lived it for 4 years. Her son looked at me when we stood to leave. He had his father's jaw and his mother's certainty, or he used to. The certainty was gone. He looked younger without it and smaller and like someone who was going to spend a long time with this moment. I didn't know, he said. It was barely above a whisper. I picked up my bag. I straightened my jacket. I looked at him the way you look at someone you used to love, when the love has been replaced by something quieter and more permanent. Not anger, not bitterness, just the clean, clear understanding of what they were capable of and what they weren't. I know you didn't, I said. But you also didn't ask. Every time I told you I couldn't explain the details, you chose an explanation. You chose hers. I walked toward the door. Josephine was already in the hallway, her briefcase in hand, her phone to her ear. I didn't pause. I didn't slow down. I moved at the pace I had learned to move over 6 years of work that required me to be decisive and invisible and certain, forward, deliberate, and completely past the point where their understanding of me had any power over my life. In the elevator, Josephine ended her call and looked at me. She didn't say congratulations. She said, "The Breckenridge closing is in 6 weeks. I'll have the paperwork to you by Friday." "That works," I said. The elevator opened into the lobby. Marble floor, high ceilings, the particular acoustics of a building designed to make people feel the weight of official things. I walked out through the revolving door into a February afternoon in Denver, cold and bright, the kind of cold that makes everything look sharp-edged and precise. I sat in my car for a moment before starting it. I had a debrief call at 4 with my project lead. I had a lease agreement to review for the Wash Park property. I had a life that had been running parallel to their version of me for 4 years, continuous and consequential and entirely real, waiting for me to come back to it. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. No pearl earrings, no performance, no story borrowed from someone else's fears about who I was. I started the car. The thing about being invisible for a long time is that you forget, occasionally, that you know exactly where you are. They never did. They were looking for a ghost and finding nothing and calling the nothing proof. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That's the first thing they teach you in my field, and it turns out it applies to a lot of things. I pulled out of the parking garage and headed toward the highway, and for the first time in 4 years, I didn't have to decide what version of myself to be in someone else's presence. I was just myself. Fully, quietly, finally. Just myself. I keep thinking about the fruit basket. Not the mediation, not the settlement, not the look on my mother-in-law's face when the room went quiet. The fruit basket my father-in-law sent me at Christmas the year I saved his company's credit line. Cellophane wrap, a red bow, a card signed with his initials. That was his accounting of what I had done. That was what my contribution was worth to him, once he'd gotten what he needed. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it because it taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way. The people who underestimate you are almost always doing it on purpose. It's easier to call someone a burden than to reckon with the possibility that they've been holding things together quietly while you took credit for the stability. What got me through 4 years of that and through the mediation and through the long months before it wasn't anger. Anger burns fast and leaves you tired. What got me through was a combination of 3 things I didn't have words for until I was sitting in my car afterward, looking at my own face in the rearview mirror. The first was knowing the difference between right and wrong and choosing right even when no one was watching and no one would ever know. I paid those insurance premiums because it was the correct thing to do for a household I was part of. I made that referral call because a family was in trouble and I had the ability to help. I didn't do those things to build a case. I did them because integrity isn't a performance, it's what you do in the absence of an audience. That consistency, maintained over years in total silence, is what made the truth undeniable when it finally had to surface. The second was thinking clearly under pressure, not reacting, not defending myself in the moment when defense would have cost me more than silence. There is a kind of intelligence that isn't about credentials or vocabulary. It's about reading a situation accurately, understanding what the room actually needs, and choosing your timing. Josephine clicked her pen 3 times before she spoke. I had been doing the same thing internally for 4 years, waiting, assessing, holding. The third was the refusal to stop. My mother-in-law's version of me was a woman who had given up. A woman who had traded ambition for convenience. The real answer was that I had been working harder than anyone in that room could see, under conditions they couldn't imagine, and I had kept going anyway. Not because I needed their approval, because the work mattered, because showing up fully, even invisibly, is its own form of endurance. The outcome at that table was not luck. It was the accumulated weight of years of doing things correctly, quietly, and with more care than anyone credited me for. Actions have consequences that compound over time in both directions. My mother-in-law built a narrative on assumption and convenience. It held up right until it met the truth. Mine held up because it was true to begin with. I think about Claire, about myself, sitting in that conference room, looking at a water stain on the ceiling shaped like a question mark. I had been asking that question for a long time. That afternoon, I finally stopped needing the answer from someone else. I already knew it. I had known it for years.